This video contains full spoilers for The Penguin. This may be a bit of recency bias, I'm not sure yet, but I think The Penguin is potentially the greatest live-action DC show ever made, with incredible performances, high-quality movie-level cinematography, compelling characters, excellent writing and world-building, and a captivating story, all while doing something that most supervillain-focused projects completely fail to do, and it pisses me off: allow their main character to be an actual villain. In fact, in spite of being the protagonist, the Penguin somehow becomes more hateable by the end of the show, as we slowly but surely learn more and more about his past, how he's always been an absolute monster even as a kid, how he has an absolutely disturbing obsession with his mom, and how he screws over anyone who gets in his way, no matter who they are, to further his own gains. The Penguin is truly cemented as an absolutely despicable villain when he kills Vic, the one person who believed in him, who had his back, without whom he wouldn't have come out on top. Oz kills him because he sees him as a weakness, doing so in an extremely gruesome and drawn out way, after which he also steals his money and throws his ID in the river, disposing of him like he disposes of anyone else, without remorse. This seems to me to be the moment that has cemented the Penguin as a truly despicable and very hateable villain in the eyes of the audience, but that's not exactly a huge surprise. The Penguin TV show was such a breath of fresh air when it comes to villain-focused projects, using the concept to its full potential to tell a story that is unique in a superhero universe from the perspective of an absolute monster, setting up that monster as what can end up being an all-time movie villain. I have never really liked the Penguin. Of all of Batman's most prominent villains, I've always found him to be the most boring. Compared to the likes of Joker, Riddler, and Two-Face, he has a relatively boring gimmick, a less interesting dynamic with Batman, and just generally far less main villain potential. The one time he was a main villain of something, Batman Returns, they had to change him up quite drastically, make him this grotesque and gross mutant who was raised by penguins. I generally just don't find the Penguin to be interesting, which is also why I was skeptical about it being the Penguin who is getting his own series. Obviously, that skepticism was proven wrong, but so was my thought process that the Penguin can't be fit for a main villain role. Depending on what they do going forward, the Penguin series has the potential to be a very unique situation, acting as a bridging between movies, setting up the villain of the second movie to be something far greater than what he would have been had the show not existed. Like I said, this version of the Penguin is depicted as an absolutely despicable person, one who, by the end of the show, I can't tell you how much I wanted to see this man beaten to a damn pulp by Batman. The show just did an incredible job of putting its audience in a situation where they despise the main character so much that all the next movie truly has to do is depict Batman kicking his ass and we'll be satisfied. Honestly, Batman's lack of presence may have even added to this. To see Oz go completely unimpeded by Batman, climbing and crawling his way into a place of power, killing many people along the way, making Gotham a worse place in doing so. The fact that Batman wasn't referenced or mentioned and didn't even have so much as a presence in this series is a bit weird, and maybe the show's greatest fault. Except, I'd say not only can it easily be explained by him being incredibly busy following the flooding of Gotham, but also it led into such a satisfying moment. The moment of Eve telling Oz that no one is standing in his way before the bat signal turns on and then the series ends. That moment is one where I genuinely cheered. Not only because, finally Batman has a presence, but also it's such a perfect setup for part 2, where we could finally see Oz get his ass beat by Batman. It's rare where a villain so heinous and yet so compelling is crafted. Not many villains could come off so evil yet so three-dimensional like what they created here. Obviously, they had the benefit of having him as the main character over the course of 8 episodes rather than the antagonist of a movie, but that's exactly why it fits perfectly as the setup for part 2. Now that the show has ended, I truly believe that the Batman Part 2 has an incredible opportunity here to craft an all-timer movie villain on the level of Heath Ledger's Joker. In fact, there are many elements that are very similar between these two characters. Both are pretty much just pure evil, but incredibly compelling. Both are portrayed by actors giving incredible performances while also being covered in makeup and putting on a voice that is not their own, that allows the actor to completely be lost in the character. I'm still blown away when I see Colin Farrell in interviews. He does not sound like the Penguin, doesn't look like the Penguin, and yet his performance, the makeup, and writing come together to create an individual that is wholly unique to the screen. The big difference here is that the Penguin is not nearly as fun a character as Joker, and he certainly doesn't have as interesting a dynamic with Batman, but thankfully we had this 8-episode series and a role in the first movie to make up for that. But also, he'd definitely be different from Joker in The Dark Knight, and more importantly, different from the Riddler in part 1, in that he'll take up a completely different role. The way those two villains worked is that they had plans that they implemented implemented and Batman was forced to play defense, acting as a reactionary to everything they do. Obviously, he used his detective work and vast resources to try and get the upper hand, but for all intents and purposes, Batman simply reacted to Joker and Riddler's plans. With the Penguin, he doesn't have a plan. By the end of the show, he's already won, clawed his way to the top, managed to convince public officials to get in bed with him, and is now Gotham's top mob boss. So now, it would be really cool to see Batman take the offensive. We could see Batman stalking from the shadows, infiltrating, maybe using his Matches Malone disguise, putting together a plan to take down the ruthless crime lord that is the Penguin, and also everyone working with him. This would set part 1 apart from part 2 and vice versa, show Batman in a more competent light as he grows and learns from experiences, and lead to such a satisfying ending where Oz gets knocked down a peg. Basically, what I'm saying is that the Penguin show has cemented Oz as my top choice for who should be the main villain of the Batman Part 2, something that truly shocked me considering how little I really care for the Penguin in general. Then, as a secondary main villain kind of working alongside him, the series might have teased Clayface. Oz's love interest, Eve Carlo, may be a reference to Basile Carlo, the original and most prominent Clayface. This was further teased in the end, where Eve dresses up as Oz's mother, putting on a sort of disguise, which was Clayface's original comic gimmick before being changed into a metahuman with actual clay powers. That original Clayface was recently adapted into Batman Caped Crusader, which was also produced by Matt Reeves, and would certainly be an easier fit into this world that is more grounded and realistic. That being said, considering no version of Clayface has appeared in a live-action movie before, I hope Eve is not Clayface herself, because that would be an insane departure from the comics, changing his gender, profession, backstory, and motivation, all while making Clayface a love interest for the Penguin. It just does not sit right with me. Maybe Eve has a brother or a cousin, or hell, even a son. The actress is 51, so she could certainly have an adult son. Unfortunately, it does not seem like the Penguin will be the main villain of Part 2. Colin Farrell confirmed he only has 5 or 6 scenes in the Batman Part 2, which I would not say is nearly enough for a main villain role. He could still certainly be further set up as the villain of maybe a third movie, or simply act as a secondary main villain throughout the entire trilogy, which would be cool, but it's unlikely he'll be the primary antagonist. But then who will be? Well, outside of Penguin and maybe Clayface, a few other villains have been potentially teased as well. Tommy Elliot, aka Hush, was teased in Part 1, both in a scene where we see the word hush and in the appearance of a relative of his, Edward Elliot. I'll be honest, I don't think these were actual teases or hints, just references brought about by how Riddler kind of took up a similar role to Hush, a serial killer with a backstory connected to the Waynes. Also, Hush has always been tied very closely to the Riddler. In his original comic, the two teamed up as the orchestrators of the overall plot, and then in the animated adaptation, they simply combined the two, revealing that Hush is actually the Riddler. I'd say they kind of did the same in the Batman, giving Riddler some Hush elements, but obviously he is the Riddler first and foremost. Having Hush be the villain in Part 2 would be extremely boring, just kind of more of the same. Honestly, I don't think they should ever adapt Hush into this world. Batman has so many villains to choose from. Don't choose one who is very similar to the Riddler in that movie. There are some potential teases to the Court of Owls in both projects. An owl is seen on one of Riddler's riddles in the Batman. In the Penguin finale, Oz goes to a courtroom that has some curtains that seem to resemble owls, and Oz's name was changed from Cobblepot to Cobb. Now, at first glance, this seems to have been done because Cobblepot is too comic booky or maybe too much of a rich sounding name to be the last name of this version of the Penguin who grew up poor. If those were the reasons, then they kind of inadvertently connected Penguin to a member of the Court of Owls, or at least they could. William Cobb, aka Talon, the court's top assassin and most prominent name, who in the comics is also the great-grandfather of Dick Grayson, kept alive and physically enhanced by a chemical compound that the court uses, which is named Dionysium. A lot of this sounds a lot more fantastical than what the Batman series seems to be going for, but if they are willing to branch out a bit, then I could definitely see them revealing that Francis Cobb's father, and the Penguin's grandfather maybe, is William Cobb, a member of a secret organization with control over Gotham called the Court of Owls. Maybe he could also be his uncle or something. That being said, that seems to me like it'd be better fit as the villain of the third movie in the trilogy, especially if that's the final one. Also, if I'm being honest, I love the original Court of Owls comic, but I haven't liked any of their outside media portrayals. They're all kind of a bit boring. The series can definitely pull that off, but the Court of Owls would definitely not be my first choice for anything in this series. There are a lot of other options who haven't been hinted at or teased but are popular choices, chief among them being Mr. Freeze, who has an extremely compelling backstory and motivation that deserves a good big screen treatment. Batman and Robin. The freeze gun is maybe pushing how fantastical this world is willing to go, but honestly, it would be stupid to change that. He doesn't even have powers, it's just some technology that doesn't exist in the real world. Mr. Freeze is definitely a top choice for me, if nothing else because I'd love to see what they do with the backstory, maybe putting a franchise-appropriate dark twist on it. Another top choice for me is Scarecrow. Having never been used as the main villain of a movie before, I'd love to see him given that chance. His fear gas can add a bit of spectacle to the movie that would allow them to implement some truly out there visuals without crossing into being fully fantastical because it's all in Batman's mind anyway. Two-Face is a character I'd actually like to see a TV show about set in this world, mostly because I don't think you could tell his origin in a movie without retreading old ground that's been told many times. And not just many times, but also told expertly in a widely beloved movie. So I wouldn't go with him as the villain of part 2, even if he could definitely certainly fit, and if he appears as a side character, that would work really well. Then is the Joker, who already appeared in part 1 and is already cast. That being said, I think most people agree the Joker should not be the villain of part 2, because he's generally overused, having been the main villain of not just 2 live-action movies, but also every theatrically released animated Batman movie, most of the Arkham games, and many other animated movies, all while also getting 2 of his own movies. I'd just simply rather see other members of Batman's Rogues Gallery get the spotlight. My ranking for who I'd like to see as the main villains from the villains I've mentioned from least to most goes as follows: Hush, Two-Face, Joker, Clayface, Talon/the Court of Owls, Scarecrow, Mr. Freeze, and the Penguin. There are many other Batman villains to choose from, but from what I could see, they would mostly work as secondary main villains rather than the main villain. Some crime lords like Black Mask or Ventriloquist can have turf wars with Penguin. Many serial killers would fit into this world really well, like Zaz or Professor Pig. They could venture out into some mercenary territory, maybe hired by the Penguin, like Deadshot or KG Beast, focus on some of the more theatrical villains like Killer Moth and Mad Hatter, or sadistic scientists like Hugo Strange. And that doesn't even consider if they branch out to more fantastical villains like Ra's al Ghul, Bane, Poison Ivy, Killer Croc, and Man-Bat. I would personally love to see a movie with Man-Bat as the villain, maybe in the DCU. I'm sure whoever they go with will end up being a great villain. I just think that they might have had the opportunity to make an old-timer Heath Ledger's Joker-level villain with Colin Farrell's The Penguin in the Batman Part 2, but maybe they didn't realize it until it was too late and they had already written the movie, because now everyone, and I mean everyone, hates the Penguin with a burning passion, and we want to see him beaten up by Batman. I guess that could happen anyway, but I'd prefer if he was the main villain when that happens.